Hi, welcome to week 3 of our life group series on discipleship and the challenges of following Jesus. Over the past 2 sessions, we've looked at the cost of following Jesus, the cost of discipleship, and then we looked at obedience in our last session together. And this week, we're going to look at devotion. Now, there's a danger that if we look at those 2 previous ideas of the cost of discipleship and obedience, that we see them as potential one-off things that we do for God. And maybe not as one-offs just like once, but just every now and then actions. Take obedience. We could say, yeah, I'm going to be obedient to Jesus. And perhaps it comes to a situation in your life where you've got to make a decision about a job change or changing location or committing to a new ministry, whatever it might be. And you feel like God is saying to you, hey, I want you to do this. And that is going to cost you. There's a cost to that. And you're thinking, this is really hard. This is really hard to be obedient, but I'm going to be obedient in this moment. And so you make that one-off decision to be obedient to Jesus, and then you just carry on with the rest of your life. Just carry on as normal with everything else. Apart from that one thing, everything else carries on as it was. The same could be true about the cost of discipleship, that we could weigh up, in our lives to make that decision, to pay that price. But then in our everyday life, with our finances, with our time, we just carry on living how we want. Now, if we really applied the words of Jesus, and if we looked at those passages we looked at over the past 2 weeks, I would hope that isn't the conclusion that we come to and the attitude that we have towards those things. But that's the potential danger. But when we look at devotion, we understand that this following Jesus, living the way of Jesus with Jesus, as we've described it, as we've looked at over the past few weeks, is not one-off, especially as we look at the theme and idea of devotion together. So let's look at a passage together from Acts chapter 2. Now, we've been looking at the words of Jesus, and we're going to unpack some more of those in a moment. But to start with, I want us to look at this idea of devotion from the early church. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, it says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer." Now, this word devotion obviously takes place here in this passage. We see it, that they were devoted to these certain tasks, and we'll look at those in a moment. But we also see throughout the book of Acts that this word devotion is used to describe the attitude that the early Christians had to their life in following Jesus with Jesus. In Acts chapter 1, verse 14, after Jesus has ascended and the disciples are waiting in Jerusalem as he's told them to, we're told that they're joined together constantly in prayer. But actually this word constantly is this same Greek word for devotion. And so that passage could be translated as that they were joined together and devoted to prayer. Devoted to one another and devoted to prayer in Acts chapter 1. Then in Acts chapter 6, verse 4, when the apostles are choosing some people to step up, the 7 deacons who could step up and take on some of the responsibilities that those leaders had so that they could do the things that they felt called to do. That once they were chosen, we're told that they are able again to give their attention to prayer. But this word attention, again in the Greek, is this same word for devotion. Other translations put it that they were devoted to prayer again. Now, it's interesting as we look at the book of Acts and we look at those mentions of devotion, we see the things that take place afterwards. After that prayer meeting in Acts chapter 1, we know the Holy Spirit comes on the day of Pentecost in power. We see that in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, when they're devoted to these, to the teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and to prayer, we read that miracles and wonders take place. People are filled with awe and show great favor to Christians. Now, there's a danger, of course, that we then take these ideas of being devoted to prayer and to church life, and that we make it formulaic. Hey, guys, if we are devoted to these things, then we will see these things take place. But I believe that instead we should approach the idea of devotion not with the end goal in mind, not with the fruits in mind, but with if we're going to use that tree analogy, with the vine, with the branches, with the relationship with God in mind. And if we look at some words of Jesus, that it places this idea of fruit and vines and branches in context. In John chapter 15, verse 4 to 5, where Jesus says, "Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you, unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." In this passage, Jesus is describing what our relationship with him could and should look like. He's saying that our relationship should be an intimate one, that we should have this desire to be close to him, to abide in him, and to understand that if we want to be fruitful, that comes out of our relationship with him. This kind of understanding is seeing Jesus not just as a part of our life, not just as our kind of religious preference, but instead seeing him as our life. Seeing our relationship with him in the context of the place where our life takes place. Understanding that we need to be devoted to him. To be devoted is to persist in something, to be busily engaged in, to hold fast to. It's a continuous action. It's a good way to describe how we should be in a relationship with somebody else, to have this devotion to them, to persist in it, to continue to push on. And maybe too often in our Christian lives, we aren't devoted. We don't have that persistence, that struggles come along or just general life busyness comes along, and we lose that sense of urgency. We lose that sense of continuous action. So what were the early church devoted to? We're told that they were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. And some of the questions for you in your life group are to look at which of these do you as individuals struggle with? Which of these do you feel the church collectively struggles to be devoted to? But you can also discuss in your life group, what does or should each of these look like for us today? You know, I shared in a sermon recently, you might have been there in our church, when I spoke on Acts chapter 2. And I said that many people often say, if only we were like the New Testament church. And when they say that, they're thinking of the signs and the wonders, the miracles, the growth that takes place. I'm sure they're not necessarily thinking of the persecution and the martyrdom that also took place in the early church. But actually what we see in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and through to verse 47 is actually a model for what we could do as church. Some of these foundational actions that show us what devotion looks like, things for us to be devoted to. But of course, we have to be careful that these aren't just activities, that they don't just become kind of church activities that we partake in. But that we understand, as Jesus says in that passage in John, that apart from him we can do nothing, that our devotion to those activities is motivated by that relationship with Jesus and about pursuing the way of Jesus with Jesus. We have to be devoted to these things because we have a desire to be in that abiding relationship with Jesus. And these are some practices that he modeled that enabled us to do so. Eating together, praying, sharing communion together as Jesus did on the Last Supper, and teaching. You know, Jesus came and taught us. He came as a rabbi and taught truths and said that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And so we should devote ourselves to the things that he said. To live the way of Jesus with Jesus. And really the way of Jesus is the way of devotion. Again, Jesus modeled devotion to us and what that looks like. But the question is just often, what are we devoted to? Maybe something you can reflect on this week as individuals, but also in your life groups. One commentator on Acts chapter 2 says this about that early church, that the thousands of new believers are persistently and continuously devoted to the essential activities and characteristics of the life of Jesus' followers. I repeat that the thousands of new believers are persistently and continuously devoted to the essential activities and characteristics of the life of Jesus' followers. The essential activities and characteristics. I wonder if this is how you view those four activities of teaching, of fellowship, eating together, of communion, and of prayer. Do you see those as essential activities and characteristics of your life group, of our church? Does your life, our lives, reflect that and those activities, those characteristics? These are some of the questions that you can discuss today, work together with as a life group and work through. And hopefully you'll be inspired and challenged to be devoted to Jesus and to his church and the activities which help us to live the way of Jesus, with one another. So have a blessed discussion, a great time together, and I'll see you for our last session looking at suffering next time.